The world often remembers the 1970s and 80s in South Korea as a period of miraculous economic ascent, the rise of modern Seoul, the promise of prosperity. But beneath this shimmering surface of rapid industrialization lay a profound darkness, a systemic effort to cleanse society of what the government deemed undesirable. This was an era where military dictatorship used the concept of national security and modernization as a shield, granting itself unchecked, chilling power. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in the quiet streets, where simply being poor, disabled, or homeless was a capital offense, judged not by a jury, but by the relentless sweep of government mandate designed to hide the uncomfortable truths of poverty from the global eye. We must understand the climate of fear and absolute state control to comprehend the horror that was about to unfold.
The legislative tool for this horrific clearance operation was enshrined in the vagrants policy. Although lacking formal legal status, it was wielded with the precision of a guillotine. It gave local authorities and police sweeping power to apprehend anyone perceived as a vagrant, often including political dissidents, street children, and even those simply waiting for a bus late at night, without warrant, without due process, and without consequence. The official narrative claimed these actions were philanthropic, efforts to rehabilitate those who could not help themselves. But the true goal was spatial and political hygiene, making the streets safe and clean for foreign tourists and investment. Under this policy, thousands disappeared, swallowed whole by institutions masked as humanitarian shelters, none more notorious or more terrifying than the Brothers' Home in Busan.
Brothers' Home was established in 1951, initially a genuine charity, but by the late 1970s, it had transformed into a self-sustaining, state-funded gulag disguised as a Christian facility. The front gates promised salvation and a new life, but inside, the structure was built entirely upon coercion and terror. Children as young as 3 were ripped from their parents' arms. Disabled individuals were forcibly taken from sidewalks, and the homeless found themselves trapped in a labyrinth from which there was no exit. The sheer psychological shock of the internment was the first stage of control. Victims were stripped of their clothing, their names replaced by numbers, their identities systematically erased, initiating their descent into a life defined only by pain and forced obedience within the high, cold walls.
The primary engine of Brothers' Home was not rehabilitation, it was profit. Under the guise of training, the thousands of inmates, at its peak housing over 4,000 people, were subjected to brutal, non-stop forced labor. They manufactured clothing, mined salt, produced fishing nets, and built the very structures of the camp. They were slaves, working 16-hour shifts, 7 days a week, often with little to no protective gear. The revenue generated by this massive forced workforce was funneled directly to the director, Park In-gun, creating an empire built on human suffering and state complicity. This system was meticulously crafted. The constant work ensured exhaustion, making resistance nearly impossible, while maximizing the financial returns for the monstrous organization. Life inside was a constant negotiation with pain. Discipline was absolute, maintained through savage beatings, systematic torture, and sexual violence. The guards, often themselves former inmates promoted for their brutality, operated without supervision or moral restraint. Failed production quotas, attempting to speak out, or even simple acts of disobedience were met with instruments of terror, wooden clubs, water torture, and confinement in dark, isolated chambers known simply as the cells. Survivors recount being forced to witness the torture of others, an intentional psychological terror tactic designed to break their will and ensure total compliance. The daily terror was not an accident. It was the mechanism that kept the gears of this human factory turning efficiently. The violence extended beyond the physical realm, dismantling the very essence of human dignity. Sexual assault became a pervasive, normalized form of control and abuse, targeting both women and children. This trauma, often carried out by guards and even higher-ranking inmates, created an atmosphere of complete vulnerability and helplessness. Furthermore, medical care was virtually non-existent. Illnesses and injuries sustained from the endless labor or the severe beatings were largely left untreated, leading to slow, agonizing deaths from preventable causes like starvation, infection, or exposure. The institution was designed not to heal, but to consume and discard, making every sunrise a harrowing struggle for survival against disease, exhaustion, and human cruelty.
The grim reality of the death toll is staggering and remains fiercely contested. Official records reluctantly admit to hundreds of deaths, but survivors and forensic evidence suggest the true number climbs into the thousands. Where did these bodies go? They were often buried in unmarked mass graves surrounding the property, or discreetly cremated, their remains scattered to erase the evidence. The speed and indifference with which lives were ended confirmed the camp's true nature. It was a death camp hidden in plain sight. The continuous flow of newly abducted victims ensured that the forced labor machine never stopped, regardless of how many perished beneath the crushing workload and the iron fist of the guards. Each anonymous burial was a testament to the government's tacit approval of mass murder.
The silence was shattered not by a survivor's escape, but by a twist of fate involving a diligent local prosecutor. In 1986, prosecutor Kim Young-won stumbled upon the horrific reality of Brothers Home while investigating a petty theft case. What he found was evidence of immense systematic cruelty, financial fraud on a massive scale, and clear signs of unpunished murder. Kim bravely launched a raid, uncovering evidence of bodies being moved and torture continuing even during his initial presence. This intervention marked the first and only official attempt to expose the camp's true operations. His actions were a beacon of moral integrity in a landscape of political decay, forcing the national government to finally confront the nightmare they had long subsidized and ignored. Tragically, the road to justice was immediately blocked by the highest levels of the Korean military regime. As Kim Young-won gathered incontrovertible evidence, the political machine moved swiftly to protect its own reputation and prevent international scandal. Prosecutor Kim's superiors ordered him to drop the charges immediately. Under immense political pressure, the scope of the investigation was drastically narrowed, focusing only on the director, Park In-gun, and trivializing the charges to embezzlement and minor infractions. The countless testimonies of torture, rape, and murder were buried. Park In-gun served less than 4 years in prison for his crimes, while the high officials responsible for authorizing and funding the operation walked free, ensuring the truth remained sealed away for decades.
Brothers Home was finally shut down in 1987, but the physical closure did not mean the end of the nightmare for the survivors. They were released back into a society that refused to acknowledge their suffering, labeled as vagrants and criminals by the same system that had tortured them. For over 30 years, their quest for recognition and compensation was met with institutional denial and legal stonewalling. The Korean state consistently refused to take full responsibility, citing technicalities and the shifting sands of political regimes. The survivors were left isolated, bearing the scars of systematic abuse, fighting not only the trauma, but also the government's official history, which had conveniently airbrushed the horror out of existence.
It wasn't until the early 2000s, driven by relentless activism and the relentless pursuit of truth by survivors, that the narrative began to shift. International pressure and changes in South Korean governance finally allowed for new investigations. In 2022, after decades of silence, South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission officially determined that the government was responsible for the atrocities committed at Brothers Home, declaring the victims were illegally detained and systematically abused. This ruling, while monumental, is just the beginning. The commission recommended that the government apologize, provide compensation, and prosecute those still alive who were responsible for the brutality and the subsequent cover-up. Justice, however, moves painfully slowly, and many victims died waiting for this official acknowledgement.
The story of Brothers Home is a chilling testament to how easily humanitarian aims can be corrupted into instruments of state-sanctioned terror when power is unchecked. It serves as a haunting reminder that the pursuit of modernization or social purity often comes at the expense of the most vulnerable.
This tragedy is not just a dark chapter of South Korean history, it is a universal warning about the fragility of human rights and the constant need for vigilance against the normalization of cruelty by those in authority. The names and stories of the thousands who suffered and died must never be forgotten, ensuring that such systematic horror, hidden under the guise of rehabilitation, can never be repeated anywhere in the world. The search for full accountability continues. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates.